Hello, and a very good afternoon to everyone who's joined us for this incredibly exciting webinar series that we're hosting today. It's absolutely fantastic to see so many of you from different parts of the world. I think I've seen Malaysia, Vietnam, the UAE, and even somewhere close to home for me, the northeast of England. As someone born in Newcastle, great to see North Shields up there. We've been overwhelmed with the response from people with over 800 registrants. And we're just really excited to get this started today. I'm Charles Wood. I'm the Director of International for Sentry Tech, the leading AI and education company based here in London. And one of the key elements of our product has been how we're using formative assessment in order to inform the recommendations that our system makes to students in over 47 countries around the world now. Before we get started, before I hand over to our esteemed guest today, just a bit of virtual housekeeping. I know a lot of you have already said where you're from and said hello in the chat box. The chat box is there to be used. Please tell us where you're from, if you're representing a school or a college or a university, and also use that for your comments. As well as the chat box, we have a Q&A function, and our speaker will have pauses throughout his presentation for some of your questions to be addressed. So please feel free to ask whatever it is you want to ask, and we'll also save time towards the end for further questions. So without further ado, it's a real pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, who's worked with over 30,000 teachers directly in more than 250 colleges, universities, and of course schools. His infamous Teacher Toolkit website has attracted downloads from more than 14 million teachers around the world, so he is truly a global figure. And if you want to follow the conversation in the companies online as well, we are using the hashtag #FeedbackFocus, and the relevant Twitter handles are @ThisIsSentry and of course @Teacher Toolkit. And so without further ado, it's my real pleasure to introduce Ross Morrison McGill, and Ross is going to be talking to us about 5 formative assessment strategies and feedback variables. So Ross, great pleasure. You've been a friend of the company since 2015. We're really excited to hear what you have to say today. And over to you.
Charles. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people telling me where you're watching from across the world. Prior to the pandemic, I had the privilege of visiting teachers all across the world. That's been remotely, as you would imagine, but slowly getting back out physically, which is good. I've been teaching since 1991, and I started blogging as Teacher Toolkit in about 2007, and it was just a diary to reflect, and then I got a bit of feedback from somebody, and now a lot of people reading the website, which takes me all over the place. More than anything, it's enhanced my teacher wisdom. So some of the ideas that I'll share with you, in fact, all of the ideas are not mine. They're ideas I've learned from the profession. And I firmly believe that teaching is a team sport. And I don't believe that any teacher can survive the classroom on their own. So without further ado, let me just put my slides up on the screen for you. I promised 5 ideas, so we'll see how we get on. I've got lots of ideas, but I've put them into 5 chunks. Before I get started, I'll just give you the kind of context. We'll do a general introduction to why I'm presenting these ideas to you, and then we'll go through each of the 5 ideas and we'll pause. Charles will interrupt, give me some questions from yourselves through the chat box, and I'll respond. And at the end, I'm happy to stay on the line and go through individual questions, etc. So let me just kind of summarize everything. Why do we assume written feedback is the best form? Now, I know there's people watching in a wide variety of contexts, and if anything, we all must consider that teaching is incredibly nuanced, very different in different places. According to where you teach, the students, your own experience, all these factors make teaching and learning very multifaceted. But in some jurisdictions where there's high accountability, marketization, etc., you'll often find that written feedback is often perceived to be the only or the most used, most popular. But when we use the word marking, I guess something that I'll remind you of throughout a session is we need to ban the word marking and use the word feedback, because feedback comes in at least 6 forms, which I'll go through throughout the session. And there are many different influences which determine your feedback success. So one of the key slides that I'll pause is going through those different types and the different influences. And some of the work that I do today looks at teaching and learning policies in schools to try and develop all teachers together within the school, rowing the boat together to achieve the vision and values, and to ensure students receive a degree of consistency in the classroom. And I'll talk about that in a moment also. Ultimately, what our feedback is, and in this case, we're looking at formative feedback. We know summative has a place, but we want all of it to make the child progress. We want them to become a better learner. And my relationship with Century dates back when I was a vice principal in a large secondary school in London. 2,000 kids, 250 staff, and Century, very much in the earlier days of their evolution, I guess some of my interest was trying to make their software, which was just phenomenal even back then. So imagine the technology and the kind of developments they've done since. That artificial intelligence to tell you what to do as a teacher, and those bite-sized reports really in the moment helps that formative feedback. So technology, we know, won't replace teachers, but it's certainly there to make our jobs a little bit easier. So that information allows us to tell students what to do next. And encompassing all of this, my Mark Plan Teach work is pretty much this loop cycle that all teachers have to focus on and use each of them to inform the other. So my mark, when I say mark, I mean assessment. And I'll talk about one of the first ideas I'll come back to shortly. That's having a secure overview of your classroom, your curriculum, and the students in front of you in order to plan coherently, in order to teach well. So I'll come back to those 3 points. And before I do, let me just put these slides up here. This hyperlink here, sure Central will put this in the chat box for you, but it needs a capital CPD to work. Or you can put your mobile phone up to your screen and scan that QR code. It'll take you to this landing page on my site. And those 2 red bars at the top, you'll get the slide deck that I'm going through if you want to take those now, or they'll be circulated after anyway. And the resource pack. So the resource pack is a larger set of A4 slides. The slide deck is just a small summary where you can see all the content. And there's a few more goodies on that landing page also. Take it a little bit further. Inside Mark Plan Teach, so these are all the ideas that I've tried in my own life as a teacher and my life as a school leader, and then developing them online and in schools with, Charles mentioned earlier, 30,000 teachers face-to-face, but online particularly, it's now pushing nearly 90,000 teachers. And I've learned what works in different contexts, or what ideas are ubiquitous for all teachers across the world. So on that note, let me just show you those ideas within the book. There's 30 ideas. These are the first 10 ideas. Now I've color coded the ones in green that I'm going to try and touch upon within the first couple of core ideas. I call it marked, but it's essentially assessment. And I just dwell upon those kind of green cells there. The secure overview, as I've mentioned, is having a good rounded picture of your students and their curriculum. The not yet is a great motivational strategy to write or to speak to students. The live feedback, lots of strategies in the moment. I'll come back to the term assessment shortly. Marking codes, you know, what symbols do we use in our classrooms? How do we use them, and do we teach our students to understand them in order for our feedback to be successful, is something I'll mention. And then number 9, all teachers are busy. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me here this afternoon, or another part of the time zone, wherever you're watching. But for me this afternoon, number 9, working harder and smarter as a teacher and getting the students to do more and you do less. So I'm very much about simplifying the complex world of the classroom. So those are the first 10 ideas in the book, and you're going to get these resources shortly. The other section is the plan section. So this is your curriculum and lesson plans. And the 2 ideas in the green boxes, I'm very into cognition, and I'm learning lots about memory and retention, because as teachers, we want students to remember things. And I think one gap in my teacher training way back in the 90s was, yes, we did cognitive development and child psychology, etc., but I didn't really understand how memory was shaped. And throughout my own schooling, and then as my formative years as a teacher, Well, I guess haphazardly I learned how I remembered stuff or how I might get students to remember stuff. A lot of the new teachers I work with across the UK are being taught this explicitly in order to change the way they deliver information to help it stick. So we'll come back to those 2 points in a moment. The other set of ideas, so this is the last 10, so 30 in total. I'm going to talk about some modeling strategies. I've got my visualizer here, and I'm also going to come off the slides and do some kind of visual demos with you. And then number 5 there on the screen is, I think on your feet, that formative assessment, the greatest tool a teacher can possess is the ability to ask a wide range of questions and be able to ask a range of types of question to hold students to account and to regularly check for understanding. So all those ideas, everybody, I've redesigned them into a placemat. So there's a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner. If you're a teacher watching, in that top line, the green kind of bar, are all the ideas that are very applicable for teachers. And many of the ideas today I'm going to touch upon in this area. If you're a teacher in charge of other people, so a middle leader working in a school or college setting, then that middle row, the ideas and mark plan teacher will suit you there. And if you're a school leader, so if you have the privilege and responsibility of looking after a large number of teachers across your organization, then some systematic ideas and strategies to reform not just feedback, but lots of the things that we do in schools to make teachers happier and hopefully us all perform a little better. So that's a placemat, QR code in the bottom right. And then you've got the book itself, me presenting all the ideas in video, and I'm going to develop a few more of those for my site later this term. The sketch notes, this one here, 16 million readers reading the website. The average reading time, one of the things that I do looking at my website is looking at the analytics. It's allowed me over the last 13 years to understand teacher behavior online and what ideas resonate. So the average reading time is about 90 seconds. So within the book, there's 60,000 words. So translating each of the ideas into 1-minute cartoons, these have been super popular and a great CPD resource for teachers. So I'll send those your way later. And then there's the slides also. So that's all the kind of general introductions. Just before I get into the thick of the end of the ideas, let me just survey your opinion. So in the chat box, I'm sure this link has been shared. It can be lowercase. If you can put it on your mobile phone device or another screen on your computer in front of you. I'm just going to switch the first slide and the link will appear at the top. I just want to see if most of you get connected. So I'm just going to ask you what you had for breakfast today, just as a fun question to see how you get, to just see if you've connected to the software. Okay, you've got a couple of people in good. So all through the pandemic, all these resources have been super popular. I've been using this kind of technology. I was saying to Charles just before we started, I've been doing webinars for 10 years. So it's great to see, obviously, pandemic a byproduct, but a lot of people upskilled using lots of different tools and technology and lots of this kind of quizzing software in class and in teaching and learning situations. It's a really good tool for feedback. So this is the one that I use. So I can see people are getting connected. I've got 3 key questions that I want to ask you that I ask all teachers that I meet with. And then I'll just share the insights that I've seen from working with thousands and thousands of teachers. So I can see the majority of you got connected. Okay, so thank you. So here's the key question I would like to pose. On the screen, I would like you to type one word into your device and then press the submit button. What's the one thing that drives you crazy as a teacher? So if we've got about 250 people watching live. So let's see if we can get one response each from everybody. If you've already put one in, type in one more word and it'll build up this wordle. And the more words that appear, the larger the word. So I might just hide these words for a moment and leave the instructions on. And then we'll just see what it says in about 10 seconds. So one word at a time, folks. What is your number one workload issue? And let's see what it shows. Okay, so we're just coming up to 100 results. So let's have a look. Okay, keep them coming, keep them coming. Now, the interesting thing here is there are a lot of people working from different backgrounds, different responsibilities, and in different locations. And the very interesting thing that has featured, and I suspect it's why you're here, is that horrible word in the middle that's nice and bold and in red, that word marking that drives all teachers crazy. And when I started research teacher workload as part of my doctoral degree, looking at teacher workload and autonomy, um, and I'm still in that burden I haven't completed, I'm far from completing, but I'm researching teacher workload. Marking appears in every type of school setting you can imagine. So I guess one quick fix, and I'll remind you this throughout, let's ban the word marking and use feedback, because feedback can manifest itself in at least 6 different ways: feedback, feed up, feed forward, written feedback, which is your marking, verbal feedback, and non-verbal feedback. Here I am tapping my watch, thumbs up, thumbs down. There are different ways of providing feedback. So one fix, everybody, we need to change the narrative with ourselves as professionals and also with parents and our students. Ban the word marking. I know it's not as easy as that, but we can start to shape that narrative. Let me just put 2 more questions on the screen. You've got 3 or 4 choices on your device now as it refreshes. Which areas of school life do you think teachers find challenging? So this is drawn upon my research and Just Great Teaching, looking at teachers across the UK. I interviewed 300 teachers and gathered 10,000 bits of data. And I shall tell you what they said in a moment, but I just want to see what you would say right now as we are in the midst of a pandemic. Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds, but it looks like we've got a front runner there, assessments, with a teacher wellbeing close behind. Okay, let me just change the question slightly. So last question, everybody. So this one's the same topic on what you find challenging. Where do you lack confidence? Let's see if that result is the same. Okay, well, I thought assessment was going to win, but there we go, SEND. So for people watching in lots of different parts of the world, special educational needs and disability, just to ensure that that abbreviation is explained. Okay, so that's a clear front runner. Okay, so assessment is your what you find challenging, so marking and assessment. Confidence, being a little bit more astute with resources and strategies to support those students. You wouldn't be alone. So I'll show you the results in a moment. Let me just whiz past a couple of bits of data I've researched. So there's a great app here in the UK called TeacherTap. They've been around for a number of years, but this is a screenshot from 3 years ago when I first started to research verbal feedback. FSM stands for free school meals, and we divide student population quintile 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in terms of poverty deprivation. You'll see that if you work in the primary sector, your school, 65%, is more likely to say mark once a week, use a purple pen. So we have kind of, in a joking way, some terminology here in the UK, purple pen of progress, or think pink, tickle green, that type of stuff. And if you work in a secondary school or high school, for people watching elsewhere, 85% teachers reported that they're told to mark by frequency and by compliance. Frequency, mark once a week. Compliance, use the purple pen. And in terms of the results that I collected, teachers said, well, we're really confident with teaching and learning. Marking, plan, and teaching is what we want to focus on. But where we struggle, you mentioned assessment and SEN. So you're right. And teacher wellbeing also came in there. But that's confident, or the challenge was what you said was the marking and feedback. But where teachers lack the confidence were particularly these areas. So you can, and this is a UK audience, so just for your own comparison and context, just in terms of comparing, I guess a global audience here is quite interesting. Now, in my life as a school leader, I was quite frustrated. I'm a design and technology teacher, so food tech, textiles, graphics, CAD CAM, pneumatics, in the resistant materials classroom, making tables and chairs. And sometimes we had to put some bits of work in books for evidence purposes rather than organic purposes. And my life as a school leader, going across whole school situations, trying to determine consistent marking and feedback was impossible, because we know that marking and assessments and feedback looks different in different subjects. It looks different in year 1, year 6, year 11, so on and so forth. So I started to do a bit of research, and I'll talk about this research later, but I started to go back to basics. So a question for you all: what is the etymological meaning of the word assessment? Maybe put some answers in the chat box. So if you do your research, your kind of Greek Latin origins, it means to sit beside. And I think we've lost this, obviously, with accountability, technology, etc., and lots of tracking sheets. I'll show you those in a moment. It appears that summative feedback has taken over the formative feedback aspect of the classroom, to sit beside a child, to provide meaningful feedback for them to improve as a learner, and also perhaps improve a specific piece of work. So I think that's important. And I think if I could summarize everything on one slide, this is what I think I've seen on my travels in all schools, and how schools struggle between, on the left, parents, inspections, league tables; on the right-hand side, not making decisions, people not taking part in professional development. And then there's happier schools where teachers are happy. They come together to talk about teaching and learning. There's risks being exposed, there's no fear, and they're looking at research and using this to inform their practice. Teaching is a team sport. And I think that one slide best sums it up. And I think one last point to finish before we get into the practical: of some of the teaching and learning policies that I work with, this has probably been the best one here on the right hand side. And this is a school in High Wycombe, a primary school with 35 teachers. The top part, I'm not expecting you to read this, but it's got the policy terminology, the rationale, and at the bottom, the accountability: when will it be reviewed? But there's just 4 sentences in the middle, and it says this: every teacher is free to determine with the class how they'll provide feedback, written, verbal, non-verbal. People should be able to explain how they get feedback, which is great. I think evaluating this will need some unpicking. 3, you don't need to record your feedback on videos, on voice recordings, which is great for teacher workload. And of course, we want the feedback to improve the child's outcomes. And I guess we'd have to define that: poor attendance, exclusions, or is it just exam grades? I think we must, as a profession, also define what we mean by outcomes. But this is one of the best ones that I've seen. So that's a general introduction, folks. I'm just going to pause for any comments your way in the chat box that Charles might want to pose before I go into 5 very quick ideas and thoughts.
Well, we've had a few things come through, Ross, but I suspect questions that are going to be answered as we get into the depths of your presentation. So particularly around how should feedback vary for SEND learners, and then around, if you're going to try and change the perception from marking to feedback, or change that terminology, particularly if you're running an organization with thousands of students and hundreds of teachers, some strategies for actually implementing that, and success stories that you've come across. So
all right, let's go into the strategies. This is what everyone's here for. So I'm going to try and go through many of the ideas, but under 5 themes. So the first one is a kind of theoretical framework, or a way of thinking, I suppose. Before you plan your curriculum, you need to consider not only where you are, but the students in front of you. So just give you a kind of summary, I suppose, in this idea. Some questions that you need to ask yourself. You've got a 3-step process in terms of that, creating a feedback loop: is where your students are at, what data do you have, is the data reliable, and I guess other things to consider. Not all teachers have schemes of work in place, sadly. And that, I think that's irresponsible of us. I think if we're particularly looking after other teachers, we need to make sure that those exist. And then the assessments are part of the curriculum, they're planned, and that the curriculum drives the assessments, not the other way around. That's when we start to become teaching towards a test rather than the other way. Tracking tools, so you have software like Sentry and all your management information systems, those definitely have a place. And there's other questions that you can consider, but I think the core thing that we do as teachers is, yes, there's the data. Here's my classroom. There's a projector, there's 20 chairs, etc., and it's this funny shape. I have the logistical infrastructure to support my assessment planning to then determine what to do when I meet the students. And that's stage 2 on the right-hand side. I might want to do an assessment, quick quiz, quick bit of discussion in the class, and I start to evaluate how my students are performing on a daily basis to then work out what to do next. So some of the things that happen when summative starts to dominate, we start to have tracking sheets that look like this. So this is a very detailed, I'd say version on a bad example, where things become a bit too detailed. Things start to lead to inconsistencies, and some of the data, not for this session, but on the right-hand side, these color codes start to be misleading, start to be confusing, and start to provide you with conflicting messages. And I think if you have this kind of spreadsheet, here's a primary one here with 33 kids on it, you need to ensure that this data is accurate and it can tell you what you don't already know. And a tool such as Sentry provides you with that information. It provides you with recommendations where to best place your efforts. And this, with software tools such as this, where it happens very quickly, it definitely is brilliant for saving time. Whereas, for me teaching a long time, these bits of information had to be created manually to begin with. It would take hours. So yes, secure overview, but this process I've got on the screen, the data is useful, the summative data, but what I really need to do is meet my students, assess, look at their strengths and develop areas for development, teach them how to assess self and peer. I'll talk about this later on, and then get to know them behind the scenes through pastoral channels. Watching Ross on the playground, talking to Ross's form tutor, parents at home, etc., to build up this secure overview. And I guess finishing off this particular theory idea before I do some practical, summative and formative has a place, but it should diagnose what I need to do next with that child to help improve. So that first stage. Second stage, thinking about the new term ahead. And an idea I took from Carol Dweck's research on mindset was the phrase, not yet. It's very powerful. Ross, that's a great piece of work. You've not yet explained X, Y, Z. And I might say that written, I might say that verbally. It's another way to help develop self-esteem and motivation with your students to help them get better. And that not yet methodology, it's a great verbal feedback fix if you don't want to always have to record things down. So there are many other ideas in this particular area, but I guess, when we try to plug in interventions and different gaps, there's many here. I'm going to model number 7. I'm going to talk to you about lots of questions, that checking for understanding, that we should never assume students have learned something. That formative assessment, pose the question, students with mini whiteboards, thumbs up, thumbs down. If I gather a larger number of responses, it allows me to gather that data to then determine what to teach next in the moment, or for next lesson, whether I need to reteach it, retest, or move forward. So let me just pause there. I'm going to go into a little practical idea next, but I just wondered if there were any questions, Charles, on your side, or any thoughts from anybody.
Yeah, we've had a few thoughts and a question. There's an interesting thought from Chimezi saying that feedback requires time, and I don't think teachers are given enough time to carry out feedback, which I think is something that a lot of people can empathize with. But I suppose it's about tactics and using your time wisely, and having tools at your aid to help you with those things. And then Daria has asked if you're going to speak or will speak about your yellow box and green box theory reference.
Well, just on that note, let's get down to business. So that's the idea I'm going to talk about next. So the first question was about time. So if you're wanting to do a written feedback strategy alongside a student, assessment means to sit beside. I discovered this idea from a school in my travels in Nottingham, and they called it the yellow box. Now, there's no research to say yellow works, and if we think about vulnerable students, context is key, visually impaired, etc. But the strategy is a bit like a coaching methodology. Find one thing and fix. Now, if I go back a few years, an organisation here in England, Education Endowment Foundation, alongside a lot of the work that Department for Education here in England also did, provided these recommendations. So this next idea fits these 3 in red, where when we provide feedback, it needs to do these types of things. So I'm going to model these corrections. I find one thing and fix. So I call this zonal feedback more than anything. And I'm going to demonstrate 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the screen shortly. I then create a dialogue with the students. So I pose the questions, and I think we need to think about how we develop metacognitive skills, those self-explanation and elaboration techniques. So the why, explain to me how, would be our responses in responses to student answers are a good technique. And then something that's fast, because let's face it, if you've got 10, 20, 30, maybe 60 students in the class and you're with them for a set period of time, you need to work quickly, and you also need to get to a point where students can start to self-regulate these things for themselves and each other to reduce your burden and to help everybody move forward. So here's some examples of pictures I've collected throughout the years. This is a maths one. You'll see the teacher has done the yellow box here. Empty yellow box connotates the student. This is what I need you to do. The student has a go. The teacher can then move forward with the student work. Another example here, you can see there's a piece of writing here. The teacher has highlighted this area. That's the part they're going to assess only. The student responds with the feedback comments. Another one here, this is a very old one now. You'll see here, the teacher has written lovely detailed work, Chloe. Yes, that's needed sometimes, but if we're writing this all the time, it's going to take you a long time, and we have to ask, writing this down all the time, will that help the student? Well, it may not. It's going to take you a long time to do, but maybe we could just say it instead, or that quick smiley face is a great little strategy to reduce that written burden. Here is an example of an assignment. This is by Bryce, Christian Attitudes to Wealth and Poverty. He's in year 8. So he's about 12, 13 years old for people watching elsewhere. And you'll see there's a couple of paragraphs here. Now, I'm going to switch my visualizer on and just talk you through what I would do if this was a routine and I knew Bryce, I knew what he was capable of, and he knew how to respond to my feedback. The principle is this. There's my marking code. Most schools around the world, tick, cross, question mark, and SP for spelling. This is the methodology. I skim read, I highlight the zone, I use my code, draw the empty box, diagnose to the student what to do next. And I could say that written or verbal. So fingers crossed, let's see how we get on here. I'm just going to switch my camera. You should be able to see, fingers crossed, this is nice and large on your side. So Christian Attitudes to Wealth. Let me just zoom in a little bit more. You can see the second paragraph there. If I highlight that as an area I want to assess, it says there is nothing wrong with being wealthy. It is how people use their money that matters. So the first fix here, Bryce, SP, you spelt there in the wrong context, incorrectly. And because I know you and you're a high attaining student capable of lots more, you've made this bold statement and you've given me a bold claim with no explanation. So what I would do, if I had more space on this piece of paper, I would draw an empty box at the bottom with a diagnostic question or statement, or I might say it to Bryce in class as I was sitting alongside him. And what I might say would be, Bryce, could you redraft this whole paragraph for me? Could you make sure you spell the word there correctly and give me one example why there's nothing wrong with being wealthy? And that would be it. And now, for any strategy in your kind of classroom, for students to understand your strategies, you need to teach them. So that would be the key kind of message from me, is any strategy that is more effective has to be taught with your students. And again, this one idea, it's going to vary significantly if you're working with a 4-year-old or an 18-year-old. So context is key with everything. If I just move forward slightly, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Here's a good example where the teacher has, and this is in Welsh. I studied Welsh a long time ago. So we can see here Gilvar, this is the Battle of Hastings, King Harold. Gilvar, smart, Gelvin, smarter. So a little grammatical fix, redrafted, student response. A bad example, you can see here when this great idea is lost in theory, is when the teacher just red pens everything, and unless I'm sitting beside the student to explain what all these ticks mean, It's a great example of cognitive overload where there's too much information. Unless the student's capable to self-regulate their feedback and move forward, much of this work that I do will be lost. So there's one really popular idea, and there's pros and cons to every classroom idea, and they will not work everywhere. So it's really important that all these ideas I present, that you select which ones might be applicable to you in your context. A quick pause, Charles, any comments?
We did have a comment from someone saying that they're starting to use more or link more formative assessments in an approach to build up to summative assessments. That sounds like a good approach, Nabanita. And I just had a comment on, you must have seen all sorts of visualizers in your many trips to schools, and I wonder if you'd seen any particularly innovative or interesting approaches in different phases or subject areas. I can see how it works perfectly.
This one I love.
This one, okay.
Now you can make this with a cardboard box and a bit of mirror from your cornflake box. It folds into your wallet, so it's lovely. And if you want to know, it's made by a very popular company, which I won't mention on this channel, but you fold it into the triangle, you pop it over your webcam, and you can turn your desk into a visualizer. Fabulous for your back pocket. Okay, and that's, every teacher can have one of these, and so can every child if you've got a spare bit of mirror and a spare piece of cardboard. And it costs nothing. You can make that cost nothing. And I've got all the devices here that cost several few pounds. Okay, back to the slides. I'm going to try and whiz through a couple more ideas and get to these influences, which are a bit more kind of research and theory for you to consider in your professional practice. You strip everything away. We want students to be able to do things for themselves, their work, their behavior, whatever it must be. And you need to teach these things as well as their ability to self-assess and peer assess each other's work. Otherwise, it's a redundant strategy if they can't do that well. So you need to invest time to do this. If I say to you, could you draw a picture of a volcano? Could you label the diagram? Inside this gray box here are all the things that now happen internally to you as a student. You've got your cultural capital, things that you already know, your motivations, Monday morning, Friday afternoon, all the strategies you already have. You'll set your goal, you'll select strategies that I give you or you've already accumulated, and then you'll set your internal learning goal. And the challenge for me as a teacher is I need to draw that out. And if I don't, I'm going to really struggle to work out in these classroom signals, these cues, what to teach next. So this area, folks, everyone on the screen, looking on the screen here, these signals that you see in classroom, attention, response, discussions, posing questions to each other, etc., taking part in the lesson, all these things you build up over time. And that's that secure overview point I mentioned earlier. To be able to establish this in a one-off context, even in this webinar, is impossible. But if we met again tomorrow, next week, and so on and so forth, like you do as a teacher, you gather lots of valuable non-verbal data also that allows you to determine students' motivation, their behavior, their cognition, to really give you a wide picture of what's going on in the classroom. And this is a great piece of research by Nicol and McFarland-Dick, which I talk about in my Mark Plan Teach. Couple of other things, marking codes. I said that most teachers tick cross SP question mark. Obviously, if you're teaching kids grammar, you need to go into a bit more detail, but these things need to be taught. You create marking code symbols so students can respond and see all your symbols and understand what they mean. They then learn these things for themselves. We mentioned visualizers, a great mantra: I do, we do, you do. Now we're a bit pushed for time, but if I just switch back to my camera, we know the most effective teachers regularly model. So if I did a quick demo on my visualizer here, let me just make sure I've got this turned on. There we go. And I need to show you what a good one looks like. So I'm going to first of all just mark out a clock and mark out 12 o'clock, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Draw 3 guidelines. These are my angles. This is what a good one looks like. We're trying to draw a cube in 3D, or what might end up being a dice. And the stages, step by step. So I do it first, kids watch me, then we do it together, then you do it on your own. So you're watching me, 3 lines, 8 to 2 o'clock, 10 to 4, parallel over the top, 10 to 4 o'clock. We then have 3 parallel spaces. 12 to 6 o'clock, there's 2 parallelograms on top of each other. That's my center line. There's the right parallelogram over the top. There's the left. And if we switch our perspective goggles on, we can start to see the framework I've developed for drawing a cube. And this might be something I would do with maybe 8, 9, 10-year-olds as their first graphics lesson. And we'd take it forward and we'd have more ideas, but it's a great formative strategy. If I just put these slides back up here, for building in a great mantra. I do it first, watch me. Now let's do it together to develop that security to a point where students are not only developing relationships, but students will start to take risks. And with the visualizer technology, you can put Ross's example under the camera, talk about it in front of the class, etc., etc. It's a great, great strategy. So your codes, ranking, grading, mocking. If you all produce that cube drawing, we could rank them without a grade, then attach a grade and do lots of mock assessments. And it's a great little way to develop regular feedback strategies in class. Back to the research on all the different things from the Department for Education on marking and workload, going back a number of years, these 3 words still resonate. Whatever strategies you use, it's got to be manageable for yourself as a teacher. It's got to mean something for the student and motivate them to be able to do the work with or without you. And I think of all the different ideas we do with teachers in the classroom, these are just lots of the things that I've been collecting over the years, things that make our life a bit easier. If I just signpost maybe number 8, before you leave the classroom, children, could you leave your book open on the page, put it into my hands, and as you leave the classroom, I'm going to mark your work straight after you've gone. And it's a great end of the day, or if you have a non-contact period time straight after, and you want to look at the work there and then, it's going to save you 30 seconds flicking through the book to find where the student has done their work. And these little fixes are great ways to develop self-regulation and reduce your workload time. A couple other things, 5-minute lesson plan from me. It's incarnated into lots of different thinking frameworks. This is a great one for thinking about a scheme of work that you're teaching and what pieces of work will be assessed summatively, formatively, which points of that assessment will be shared with students, and what parts of the schemes of work will be retaught in the moment or when you reteach that scheme of work again. And this is all explained on my website in greater detail. If I pop back to McGill and McFarlane-Dick, the 7 principles for developing good feedback habits in class, I show you what a good one looks like. I then pose a question or ask you to do something. I then respond with some feedback. So I'll give you a great verbal feedback tip in the next idea. Group work, that self-regulation has to be taught. I need to build that in. I then provide you with the word not yet. You've not yet, Ross, drawn that cube accurately. And it's a great little verbal or written technique. I then plug in my intervention, so a range of strategies that I'm showing here, and I use it to work out what to teach next in the moment or for next lesson. Some of you might be marking all your books. So this emerged across the English teaching profession about 8 or 9 years ago. Instead of marking all the books, I annotate this one sheet. I then use this to sit beside the students as my script and feed back the information to students. And I wouldn't necessarily display this in class on a board, because if Ross's name always appears here, that subculture of peer relationships where they all make fun of me, playtime, etc., could be quite damaging. Taking it further, having done a little bit of work with John Hattie, thinking about feedback, feed up, feed forward, 3 different types of feedback. You've got the italic definitions here, comparing work to actual work, comparing it to past work, or comparing the work to future performance. There are different ways that you could take this original template, if you've seen this before, and redesign your feedback to 3 different groups of students. In England, we tend to use high, middle, low attainers, but I wonder if you think of all classrooms that have students that fly, whatever the concept or topic is, students have a misconception, I've got a question, you clarify, then they fly. or a third group of students that always struggle and need a bit more love, care, and attention. And you can then reshape your feedback over time to suit those three groups. And then again, in my keeping with my 5-minute lesson plan thinking, I've redesigned this into a bit of a lesson plan for you that you can use. So these grey texts are little prompts. I guess one that I would need to explain, this one here. Ross, go and see 3 other students before you come back to me. So I reduce that burden on myself, get the students to self-regulate with their peers, and that's a taught process. So quick pause, everybody. Any questions, Charles?
There are a few questions, Ross, and I think they're quite big questions. So I'm going to save them to the end. One nice comment from Francois, just saying that he's using Google Chrome and Google Classroom to leave verbal feedback, and he's found that his children like listening to the teacher's voice, and obviously it's much quicker than writing comments. So that's great that you're using that tool. And I'll save the questions, the good questions, for the end.
All right, so part of my research recently was looking at verbal feedback rather than always having to write things down, trying to save that burden for teachers. These are the schools that I visited across England, 13 teachers for 5 days across the academic year, just before the pandemic. And these schools typically were high poverty, where schools typically ask their teachers to mark once a week and use a particular coloured pen. So I was very grateful that these schools were allowed to attend and take part. There's the statistics. I'll skip past that. You can look at that later. But these are the teachers I'm working with at the top over the year. And then Mark Quinn here at University College London, developing ethics, anonymity, data collection, thinking carefully as a researcher in the classroom. And we wanted to publish some new knowledge to help the teaching profession. So this is the question we posed together. To what extent does verbal feedback, when we introduce it for 2 terms, so from October to June of an academic year, improve student engagement? And we particularly focus on the most disadvantaged students. Now, I won't go into all these details, I'll signpost them to you, but we spent a long time defining the question and engagement. There was 4 pages of this, but you can kind of see the key messages here. One key thing I always get back from teachers is, how do you evidence verbal feedback? Well, here you go. So there's tons of this in this report. And then of all the techniques that we used, and I'll just show you a couple to 2 or 3 just to finish this particular idea, but these were the most popular. Remember that there were 13 teachers. So you can see here, live marking using the visualizer and that yellow box technique were the most popular. And all these teachers, for context, were secondary teachers teaching all the different subjects. I have discovered on my travels that many of these can transfer to a primary classroom, maybe not early years, but definitely to kind of low key stage 2, higher key stage 1, if that makes sense. So here's one quick strategy. I've been using this for 10 years and it's in my DNA, and I call it Pipple: praise, probe, identify, plan, lock. It's inspired by a great book called Leverage Leadership by Paul Bambrick-Santoyo. And you can master this in 30 seconds. It's great for behavior conversations. It's great for lesson observation feedbacks with other teachers. But in the classroom, let's imagine Ross is calling out. I grab Ross for a quick chat in the corner. Ross, you're working really well today. Why do you keep calling out in class and ruining it for the whole class? Oh, it's because I sit next to Charles, sir. He keeps digging in my arm, or I missed last lesson, or I wasn't listening. Okay, let's make a plan. Shall we move seats, or do you want to do X? I allow the student to choose. I've given them a choice, but I've selected those choices. And then I ask them to repeat back to me, lock, tell me what we've agreed, so I can check that they've understood. And that's a great 30 seconds structure for feedback, for behavior management. It's also a great script for lesson feedback. And of all the things I'm throwing at you today, if I could say do one thing, it would be this. And it's totally changed my working life as a teacher, and difficult conversations or coaching conversations I have with teachers or head teachers on my travel. Do this, please. It's a brilliant strategy. Get it into your DNA and make it an automatic process. A couple of other things on feedback. When we provide feedback, we need to make sure that we avoid criticism. This is an example. Ross, that was a great session, but too fast. Sometimes we need advice. As a new teacher or a new person in a job, we need to be told what to do. We all need a bit of a compliment, but we can argue that these two don't always exclusively improve our practice. When we develop self-regulation through formative feedback, we want to make suggestions to elicit that new thinking, that metacognition in ourselves and in our students. So questions you might pose here would include, what would happen if? Why have you chosen A instead of B? Explain to me why you selected C instead of D, and so on and so forth. And it's really important to frame your feedback. One other strategy is this one. I'm a big fan of non-verbal feedback. And I've got my whiteboard to hand here. I'm just going to do this equation on the board. So for maths teachers watching, 7 times something equals 28. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Version 1, 7 times something equals 28. Version 2, 7 times something equals 28. So in the chat box, what's the difference? Version 1, 7 times something equals 28. Version 2, 7 times something equals 28. The answer is the double tap. Version 1, 7 times something equals 28. Version 2, 7 times something. And to make it more powerful, in a virtual world or in the classroom physically, I face you, 7 times something equals 28. Non-verbal formative assessment data includes non-verbal taps and eye contact and the body positioning so that I'm facing the rest of the room, not my head to the back of the room. And you can see how I can pronounce this complicated word. And in a remote world, other things also include thumbs up, thumbs down. And we do this all the time, but we do it consciously, I would say, particularly in a virtual setting. Also, when you look up, the pause also helps process formative feedback. The look back, so I've got a pen to hand, but we look back at an object, also helps cognition. So all these ways are ways that you can enhance your formative strategies in the classroom that you do all the time already, probably need to just work on methods for doing it a bit more consciously. So where are we at? So I won't dwell on the report much longer, but you've got there all the report. I guess just look at number 4. Sorry, not 4, the 4th row down. When teachers said we don't do written feedback anymore, it has a place, but instead we use verbal feedback, we got our lives back and we spent more time planning better lessons, which met our children's needs. So there's my takeaway quote on the left. And that report you can download on my website. Now, this is the slide I want to finish and dwell with, and then I'm just going to finish with one quick idea after the next pause. This is probably going to need a bit more reading from you. It's explained on my website, and there's the link to the original research in the bottom right-hand corner. All these strategies that I present to you, they're all going to have a hit and miss ratio. Why? Because the type of task I set will make a difference. How I present the feedback or the information or the target, if it's a competition or if you're being watched, how you evaluate it, the norm reference. So this is your, if I ranked all your work publicly, it's going to make a big difference. Positive, negative, general, focused, all these things. I won't go through them all, but I'm going to just show you them here. Now, of all the work that I do with teaching and learning policies, there are mechanical things, marking once a week, purple pen of progress, but not many factor in feedback influences. What makes a difference to, if we choose one idea to do as a group of teachers in a school, what factors do we need to be aware of that determine their success? And I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of this in terms of finding that silver bullet. But at least we can try to be aware of these and understand their influences so that we might determine which strategy to use with who, at what point of the year, and what to deploy and when. And there are lots of things, but this is a real key one. I could probably talk about this particular slide all session, and it really needs unpicking. And I think the more we understand the influences, I think particularly for school leaders, will be a bit less controlling or accountable of our teachers. I think the challenge for us all as teachers is making sure that this information is communicated with our parents so that they still don't perceive that written feedback is the only way to provide any type of feedback. Any thoughts, Charles? Any burning questions? And I'm going to whiz through 1 or 2 more ideas and then we are done.
Lots, but maybe let's just stick with one from Carolyn, who's asking, how can I avoid overload in marking, please?
My top tip would be to look at the yellow box as a strategy. Try and focus in, and you use the strategy proportionate to curriculum time, but the yellow box I would probably deploy as a routine, make your students understand it, and I guess the message is just focusing on one thing for the student to improve. They fix it, you can then provide them with more detailed feedback over time. But give that one a go, Caroline, see how you get on. Okay, so back to the notes. The 5th idea I have for you here, and there's probably lots of ideas inside each one, so I do apologize, but I wanted to give you as much as I can in the short time we have together. Questioning. It's the biggest skill that you need to master. Now, I won't go through all these, but there are many techniques you can use. If I just pause on this first line, scanning the room, as well as avoiding the question, who can tell me where Mount Vesuvius is? Well, I'm giving you the choice to opt out because you can't tell me. So instead, I need to say the name. And lots of research recommends to delay the name so that you encourage more students to think about the question. And if we do think, pair, share, I don't know if you're thinking about the question, so I need you to write it down. And the research on retrieval practice in particular, its simplest definition is to say it or write it. So rather than who can tell me, I pose the question, where is Mount Vesuvius? I pause. I then ask you all to write down an answer, tell it to your friend, and now show me. And if I get my whole class to do that, you're going to be working very well and holding your students to account. There's lots of others in here. I think multiple choice, make sure the choices available are hard. If they're too easy, it reduces that thinking. Learning should be a hard process. A couple of other things here from me. If I skip this next slide here, different questioning types. So we know about open and closed questions, but there are many others that you can use. Here are just 7. And if I give you 2 or 3 examples, task questions, so questions that derive a task. So question 5, can you walk from London to Berlin? Well, you probably need a boat at some point, or not if you walked under the Eurotunnel, so you could technically walk there. A thesis, so to evoke a question, an assignment or an essay. What is gravity? Multiple choice, so again, I mentioned earlier that making the choices hard, great for retrieval. And a quick 30-second check, you're going to really develop that retention over time. So on a screen, on one slide, you could delete this slide and create lots of different types of questions for a particular topic, would be the top tip there. And then my favorite resource, Question Matrix. This is a very popular resource on my site. And so there's a QR code on the slides and the link take you to the right place, but essentially add an image. What is happening in this image? Where did it take place? What time did it happen? Who should help this man lying on the floor? It's a great way to design questions for specific areas, focus students' thinking, get them to put post-it notes on the screen or live in the classroom. It works in so many different settings, and it's a super popular resource. And I guess if you put me in a corner and I said, what are my favorite strategies? Probably be these for questioning, hinge questions or pivot points. What do you think? So it's a response to a student's answer. No opt-out. You might be familiar with Teach Like a Champion by Doug Lemov. Rather than you give me a weak answer, I navigate the classroom, come back to you, and you elaborate the details, having heard a better answer. In cold call, you'll also find in Teach Like a Champion, Fermi questions are great questions for discussions. If we were in a classroom space together, I might say, how many balloons can you fit in this classroom? Straight away, the discussion gets going. I haven't told you that it's a hot air balloon or a mini water balloon. And straight away, we get a question process taking place. So there's lots. and they're all explained in a little bit more detail. I've also given in here, if I just signpost some things to finish, there's a little video example of a cold calling technique from Doug Lamoff's Teach Like a Champion. I explain here Mary Budrow, her research on wait time. Most teachers wait 1 second. We need to wait longer to help retention. And then Enrico Fermi, you've got here. I've given you lots of examples of his question and methodology. How many? A great statistical question to evoke lots of creative responses. And you don't necessarily need to find the answers here. It's a great discussion strategy. It's also good to reduce your workload and get the kids thinking for themselves. So I'm going to pause there. I've gone through loads and I'm way over time, as I thought I might be. But in summary, folks, there are several ways to provide feedback, not just written. Feedback, feed up, feed forward, verbal, written, non-verbal, and then all the 16 influences, which I think you'll need to return to and look at in a bit more detail. If you're a school leader watching, think about how they might factor into your teaching and learning policies. Ultimately, whatever we need to do, all those influences, we want the students to become better at their learning, their self-regulation, and that this information through quizzing, through planning, whatever it might be, informs our next step in the moment or next lesson. Now, there's lots more in the slides, but I'm not going to go through them. It wouldn't be fair. But I'm going to stay on the line for lots of questions. But I think that's formally it, isn't it, Charles? But it's been a real pleasure. And I'm sure it's been a whistle-stop tour. So please watch back the recording and teachertoolkit.co.uk for all your resources. Thank you, everybody.
Well, Ross, thank you so much. I think mindful of my cognitive load, I know that ran out quite early on. So just to reassure everyone who's on this call, we will be making the recording fully available to you, as well as Ross's slides. So you'll be able to go back over them, share with colleagues, and there's some fantastic resources there to get stuck into. We are out of time and lots of people have been dropping off and left really kind messages. So yeah, we're grateful for you all being able to attend and grateful to be in a position to be able to put these types of sessions on, and hopefully you've all found it really useful. I did notice one question which really stood out to me, Ross, which perhaps you wouldn't mind answering. Bev has asked, what do you think about the aim of making assessment indistinguishable from teaching and learning? Is this the Holy Grail? Quite sort of big question.
Well, it is a big question, but that is what we're doing in our policies and in our teaching and learning class. People call it different things: feedback policies, marking policies, data and assessment. But it is assessment. I pose the question. I draw in that data through verbal, written, and non-verbal signals, and then it informs what I do next. That assessment to sit beside, that Latin origin. Yes, things evolve over time, but there's a danger that it has become in certain schools, in certain parts of the world, that it's that accountability and that data collection rather than a great tool like Sentry, where the data is used to inform your interventions and force your play your card in terms of way to put your best bets. And I think as teachers, we're all tired, we're all very busy people. We have to be very efficient in how we deploy our physical and our resources, our time in the classroom. And I think, all teachers tell me they struggle with marking, but I think we all need to ban the word and use feedback or assessment in its place, and then think about all those different things that I've presented today. But it's a challenge, and what you do with a 4-year-old compared to a 16-year-old is always going to be very, very different. And that's what makes teaching very complicated, but also very fascinating.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And yes, in response to some of the comments, we will be putting more sessions on like this. And just to reassure you all, we will be sharing the resources and recording. If you'd like to learn more about Sentry, our website is www.sentry.tech, which you can find in the chat box. We're more than happy to connect with you and talk to you about some of the work that we're doing in the education space with hundreds of schools, colleges, and education institutions up and down the country. Ross, on behalf of everyone at Sentry and everyone who's attended today, thank you very much. It's been incredibly insightful and lots of food for thought, and hopefully some really practical ideas that teachers are able to take away and start deploying in the classroom. thank you for being here.
My pleasure. There's a quick question in the chat box from Tanya I have to respond to, because everyone asks, verbal feedback report has all the evidence you need to evidence verbal feedback, rather than I speak to Charles in the class, I now have to gather some evidence that I've spoken to him and he's acted on my feedback. So please, 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 if you're in that context, download the report on my site, and or go to the UCL website directly, but it'd probably be easier on my site to find it. And look at the paper, look at the research, share it with your school leaders, and determine your school how you provide feedback. Don't leave inspectors to determine that for you. But yeah, thank you everyone. Lots to digest. Please watch back the video to get the best out of it. Choose one or two ideas and stick with it and see if it makes a difference in your classroom. And good luck. And thank you for all the amazing work that you do with our young people around the world.
Absolutely. Have a great evening all, and a fantastic rest of the week.
Bye everybody.